to Cultural Competency for the Information Professional. I am both delighted as well as deeply humbled to have the opportunity to share with you today, and my hope is that you will enjoy this webinar, that it will be informative and thought-provoking, and that you'll take away something that you can use in your everyday practice. So, the good instruction librarian in me would like to offer a webinar overview just to tell you a little roadmap of where we're going to go. I'm going to start out by introducing myself a little bit more and telling you a little bit about my background. And from there, we'll go into defining cultural competence and what it means within the library and information science environment. Next, we'll briefly discuss why cultural competence is important. And after that, I'll introduce you to a conceptual framework or model for cultural competence in our profession. And then I'll walk you through some relevant standards that have been developed by the Association of College and Research Libraries. I want to preface my talk today by letting you know that due to my background in academic libraries, a lot of my references are going to come from that environment. However, what I have to share can be applied broadly regardless of the type of library where you work. And then lastly, we will wrap up and conclude, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end. All right, so let's get started. Introducing myself. Here you see a little information about my background. I have a BA in History from Spelman College and an MSLS from the Historic Library Education Program at Clark Atlanta University. I got my start in libraries back in 2000, and since then I've worked primarily in academic libraries, but I also have experience in public libraries and in an archive. After being in the profession for about 13 years, I decided to go back and work on my PhD, which I received from Mercer University in 2015. And my dissertation work focused on leadership development for librarians working in a group of minority-serving institutions. I'm also very interested in the recruitment and retention of librarians of color, which is somewhat related to the topic that we'll discuss today. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's move into the webinar. So, a good place to start is with a definition of cultural competence. And here I offer one that was provided by Patricia Overall in the article Cultural Competence, Conceptual Framework for Library and Information Science Professionals. And I'll read it to you quickly. So cultural competence is the ability to recognize the significance of culture in one's own life and in the lives of others, and to come to know and respect diverse cultural backgrounds and characteristics through interaction with individuals from diverse linguistic, cultural, and socioeconomic groups, and to fully integrate the culture of diverse groups into services, work, and institutions in order to enhance the lives of both those being served by the library profession and those engaged in service. ACRL, which stands for the Association of College and Research Libraries, also provides a definition in their diversity standards. They borrow heavily from our friends over at the National Association of Social Workers. And they say that cultural competence is a congruent set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that enable a person or group to work effectively in cross-cultural situations, the process by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, languages, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, religions, and other diversity factors in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, and communities, and protects and preserves the dignity of each. And so those are two definitions coming from different groups, but we see that in both of them, cultural competence is both an individual as well as an organizational attribute. And it manifests itself in what you do as the individual, how you think, how you work, and how the policies of your organization impact both individuals as well as groups. So just to kind of summarize a little bit, cultural competence is a deliberate behavior. It's something that you do with a lot of intentionality. It recognizes the fact that individuals come from different cultures, as well as the fact that culture influences interactions. And so those are just a couple of takeaways that I think are important in both definitions. So now that we've gotten a definition, or a few definitions rather, of cultural competence, let's talk about why it's important, or should be important, to list professionals. One of the primary reasons why this issue should be important to list professionals is because of the changing demographics in our country. Within our profession, we already know that we continue to struggle with issues of representation, and that communities are often served by individuals who come from very different cultural backgrounds. And even though there are a lot of programs out there to recruit diverse individuals to the profession, we face a mammoth task. As you can see, according to the latest Diversity Counts report, the library workforce remains overwhelmingly white. But meanwhile, the demographics of our country are continuing to shift. One of the areas to look for change is in the demographics of children and babies. Data from the U.S. Census reveals that babies of color now outnumber non-Hispanic white babies. In 2014-2015, minority student enrollment in public schools surpassed white enrollment for the first time. And by 2060, the collective minority population of the U.S. is expected to rise to 65%. So what we see here by comparing the demographics in our profession as well as the demographics in our country is that libraries will serve constituencies that look very different from the library workforce, making cultural competence more important than ever. Another reason why cultural competence is important is because it's consistent with our professional values. And here I've pulled just two of the ALA values that I think relate directly to the need for cultural competence: access and diversity. So first, let's look at access. All information resources that are provided directly or indirectly by the library, regardless of technology, format, or methods of delivery, should be readily, equally, and equitably accessible to all library users. When we take a look at diversity, we say that we value our nation's diversity and strive to reflect that diversity by providing a full spectrum of resources and services to the communities we serve. So one of the things I did mention in my introduction is that several times a year, I have the privilege of teaching a course that I develop on cultural competence for academic librarians. And one of the points that I try to drive home, and I tell the students that if they take nothing away from that course, I want them to walk away with an understanding that cultural competence is paramount to providing relevant library services. So if libraries are purchasing materials and developing programming, hopefully it's because we want the communities we serve to respond, right? We want those books to fly off the shelves, we want our databases to be used, and we want our programming to be packed. Ultimately, we want our communities to see us as the first choice for information. Well, in order for that to happen, we have to provide relevant collections, programs, and services that meet the needs of the community. And if there's a lack of understanding of the community being served, how can what we offer be relevant to the community as well as impactful? So the way that I see it, being culturally competent is just good business, and it is an extension of what the library should already be doing. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I want to talk to you about a conceptual framework for cultural competence. Several years ago, when I started exploring this topic, one of the most useful pieces of information that I discovered was this conceptual model by Patricia Overall, who I mentioned earlier in my talk. And this model highlights the various stages that one goes through in becoming culturally competent. So if we look at the x-axis, it highlights the range of possibilities of cultural competence. As you can see in the model, the first stage is called cultural incapacity. In that stage, an individual lacks the ability to become cultural competent. The next stage is cultural blindness. And in this stage, according to Overall, someone might make comments such as, "I don't see color," or "everyone is the same to me," or "I treat everyone the same." The next stage is what is referred to as a lack of cultural competence. And in that stage, an individual recognizes that they lack cultural competence, and through a process of self-reflection and reflection on other cultures, begins to develop it. At the far end of the x-axis, you will notice the stages of cultural competence and cultural proficiency. According to overall, individuals who are culturally proficient are bicultural and demonstrate excellent knowledge of cultures. Also, this model, you'll notice, has 3 boxes that run from left to right, and they illustrate some of the strategies for developing cultural competence. And so that is what we're going to delve into today. We're going to sort of walk through some of these strategies that individuals as well as organizations can engage in towards developing cultural competence. So as I mentioned earlier, my background is in academic libraries, and I have found the ACRL diversity standards from 2012 to be a great resource. They were developed in 2012 and are based on the 2001 National Social Work Standards for Cultural Competence and Social Work Practice. There are 11 standards, as well as a set of definitions and an interpretation of each standard. So if you're unfamiliar with the standards, I encourage you to check them out. You can do a simple Google search and you can find them on the ACRL website. I'm going to make some references again to the standards for the remainder of the webinar. And even though you might not be from an academic library, I believe that regardless of what type of library you're working in, the standards are very accessible and they provide some guidance for developing culturally competent information professionals, as well as developing culturally competent libraries. And so there again, if your particular specialty of librarianship does not have its own diversity standards, I would encourage you to engage with the ACRL diversity standards. They're very accessible. The information is, in my opinion, very actionable, it's usable, and it's understandable, and I think it can be applied in a variety of library contexts. So because we have a group of individuals today, even though you all may be working, we may have multiple individuals from the same organization, I'm going to primarily deal with the ACRL diversity standards that relate specifically to individuals. So this is work that individuals can begin to engage in towards developing cultural competence. And you may remember, if we go back to our model, with overall, cultural competence begins with the individuals. And so if you've chosen to participate in this webinar because you're interested in developing cultural competence, you're not sure where to start, you're in the right place, because cultural competence ultimately begins as an individual process. In an ideal world, the organization takes hold of it, the organization embraces it, but it cannot happen unless an individual embraces it. And so again, we're going to look at several standards that I believe apply primarily to the individuals, but also as we get into some of the later standards, apply to organizations. And again, there are 11 of these standards, and time does not allow the opportunity to do them justice. So I just selected a couple, and I think, again, that you'll be able to take something away from this that you can actually use and apply in your everyday practice. So I'm going to make a lot of references to Overall's model because I just love it, and I think there's not a lot out there in the literature about cultural competence for library professionals, and so it's a great resource. You'll find a lot of information out there about cultural competence in social work and healthcare and maybe a little bit in education, but there's not a whole lot out there. And even though her article was written 17 years ago, to me it is still one of the best resources for understanding how to do this work within the library profession. So if you remember, she talked about the process of developing cultural competence begins with the individual, and she calls it cultural pre-competence. This stage focuses on doing some self-reflection about one's own cultural identity and then doing some reflection on other cultures. And hopefully, after doing that, what one can take away from the work is a consideration of how culture and identity influence one's worldview and also their approach to their work. The ACRL diversity standards, they are progressive, and so standard number 1 deals with cultural awareness of self and others. Very simply, it says librarians and library staff shall develop an understanding of their own personal and cultural values and beliefs as a first step in appreciating the importance of multicultural identities in the lives of people they work with, as well as the people that they serve. And so again, this standard is very consistent with the conceptual model because it acknowledges that self-reflection is the first step in appreciating the role of culture in the lives of the people that you work with and the people that you serve. Sort of in seeing yourself and reflecting on how you identify and what culture means to you, then hopefully you will possess an ability to see how that works in the lives of other people. As I said, I teach a course in cultural competence for information professionals, and one of the first activities that we do is called an I Am Me, it's called an I Am Me poem, and you may be familiar with it. My course is fully online, and so ideally you would do this in a face-to-face setting, but it can also work in an online environment. And basically the way it works is I have students to read a few articles about identity and identity development, and then I ask them to list 10 aspects of their own identity. They also reflect on what they feel they learned about themselves through completing the activity, and they're encouraged but not required to share their identity poems with their classmates. So the purpose of this assignment is to really get students to think about how they see themselves as well as how others see themselves, and to think about how their identities influence their work. And so again, ideally, this would happen in a face-to-face environment, but it's also something that you can do online. I would encourage you, if you want to maybe take a baby step today after this webinar, is to think a little bit about identity and how you see yourself and what your personal values are, and sort of list those characteristics. If you're attending with colleagues, you may want to do this as a group activity and share that information. And I think what you'll find is that you probably see yourself very differently from how others see you, and vice versa. And so it's very eye-opening. And if you start thinking about what that means for service delivery, you discover that your worldview really shapes how you see your constituents. It sees how you interact with your coworkers. It impacts how you work in your library. It filters into your policies and your procedures and your programming. And it's, as much as you may believe that you can say, you know, I'm neutral and I don't see color and I treat everyone the same, that just isn't how things work. Oftentimes it's a very unconscious type of behavior, but these factors are at play. And what I find in my course is that this is a very difficult and challenging activity. I found people feel really uncomfortable, and I don't usually make people share their identity form if they don't want to. But it really forces you to think about what's important to you, what you value. And what I try to tell my students is that, you know, I'm not trying to tell you that you should identify differently, or I'm not trying to tell you what your values are or what should be important. But what I want to make clear is that you should possess an awareness of your identity or identities, and be aware of it, be conscious of them, and recognize there might be some situations where you might not necessarily be best positioned to provide services or to provide resources. And so with that awareness, what it really does is it poises you to be a better person, I believe, as well as a better librarian. So next, let's look at diversity standard number 2 from ACRL. And that one deals with cross-cultural knowledge and skills. Simply stated, librarians and library staff shall have and continue to develop specialized knowledge and understanding about the history, traditions, values, and artistic expressions of colleagues, co-workers, and major constituencies served. And so again, going back to the overall conceptual model, once you are aware of your own cultural beliefs and you recognize that others have different cultural beliefs, you can begin to step outside of yourself and develop knowledge and understanding of cultures of your coworkers and hopefully of your constituents. But the first part is really that awareness that people are different, that people are coming from different places, that they have different aspects of their identity that are important, that they have different values. And so if you can get to that point, there comes a recognition that, you know, I know a lot about myself, but there are some people that I work with or there are some people that I serve that I don't know a lot about. And perhaps I could do my work better and perhaps I could be more effective if I had an awareness of some of these other cultures that people that I work with or the people who are coming into my library. So how does that happen? How do you build cross-cultural knowledge and skills? Well, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. One of the ways that you can do that is through professional development, which is exactly what you're engaging in today. So you took the time out of your busy day to attend this webinar to learn a little bit about cultural competence. And again, everything that we're doing here is really basic. It's very introductory, but hopefully you're going to get something out of this that you can take and you can expand on and you can learn a little bit more about. Also, education is an option. So formal education or informal education, that could come through short courses. I will admittedly acknowledge that there are not a lot of resources out there for cultural competence in our profession. We have been kind of slow to catch up to some of the other fields like social work or education, but there are some programs out there. You have to dig for them. I often see them at professional conferences. We're very thankful for this webinar today, but you probably will have to do a little bit of digging in order to find some professional development. I know that Library Juice Academy, who I teach for, they offer the course for academic librarians. ALA and its affiliates often offer webinars, so you'll see a couple of those coming maybe from a couple of the divisions. We're also very fortunate in our profession to have the ethnic caucuses of ALA, so like Black Caucus, Reforma, so forth and so on. They offer programming at conferences, and some of them even offer their own conferences. Other avenues include, you know, reading. There are some very progressive and emerging publications out there. I don't want to sound like I'm tooting the horn for Library Juice Academy, but they do a lot of work in this area in terms of not only professional development, but some of their series are really delving into these issues, as well as a couple of journals out there, a couple of newer journals out there are delving into the issues related to cultural competence and diversity within our profession. Another way that you can gain cultural competence is through travel. Of course, being in an unfamiliar environment, experiencing another culture in depth, even if it's for a short period of time, can often be very transforming, and it can help you to think about yourself and think about your work differently. And then lastly, another place that you can build a cross-cultural knowledge and skills is through intentional interactions with cultures other than one's own. I would imagine that I have a lot of academic librarians on the webinar, and so I would imagine there's, depending on your campus, there may be some cultural programming that you can participate in. There may be opportunities where the local community is coming onto your campus for services or for programming or for interactions. Those are all opportunities to have an experience with a culture other than your own. And so I would encourage you to use these venues as opportunities to build cross-cultural knowledge and skills. And what this looks like is going to vary greatly based on where you're situated. So again, the dynamics and the demographics of your community might require you to do something different. But again, if you go back to the issue of responsiveness and relevance, you're going to want to do and engage in activities that help you to build the cross-cultural knowledge and skills for your library and for your community. And so that's going to look different, you know, just depending on where you're coming from. I also would encourage you, regardless of where you're positioned, to really know your constituency. To use another example from the course I teach, I really encourage individuals to know their constituency. So knowing who you serve is really vital to providing good service. Whether you're in an academic library, a public library, a medical library, a corporate library, this is just a really critical foundational step. So when I teach the cultural competence class, one of the activities that I have students to do is to reach out to their institutional research office to get a sense of the demographics of their campus. And what I find is a lot of times interactions with the institutional research office can be sort of a one-way street. If you're like me, you're preparing for iPads, and our institutional research office will call and they'll say, hey, we need this library data. But it's a really one-on kind of thing. But another way to think about the IR office on your campus is to see them as a resource. And so, what does your student population look like? What are those demographics? On the higher education side, where are your students coming from? How much diversity is present within your student population? What are maybe some of the financial demographics of your community? How many students in your campus are receiving financial aid? How many are Pell eligible? That's the kind of information that can help you to be responsive and to develop programs and collections and services that really respond to the needs of your community. Within the public library environment, that might be census data. So you might want to, at the branch level, really see, okay, what's going on in the census tract that's surrounding my public library, and what are the needs of this community, and how can I respond to them? Another suggestion that I have for gaining insight into the cultural dynamics of your community is to identify advocates within your organization or within the community. And again, this looks different in academic or public environments, but oftentimes you may have individuals, say for example on the college campus, that teach courses, who do community-based engaged learning work, who could serve as liaisons to the community for you. And so if you have a particular demographic that you are struggling to reach out to, consider who the advocates are within your organization. There are very likely people on your campus or in your community, regular library users who are already engaged in this work. And so there's really no need to rebuild the wheel. Something else that you may want to consider are community leaders and groups with access to the community. Oftentimes, there is a divide between the library and the community, and there is a real need for the library to position itself, for the library to be seen as legitimate. Oftentimes there may be trust issues between the community and the library, and so sometimes if you're able to develop a relationship with a respected individual in the community or a group that is very influential, you may see that that could be an inroad into understanding a little bit about the cultural dynamics of the community that you're trying to serve. I will admit to you, having done this work in the past, that it can be very, very challenging. It can take a long time. But I think, again, if we go back to, the purpose of the library, if we look back at our values, if we want to be relevant, if we want what we provide, if we want the community to respond to it, then sometimes it's going to require some really hard work, some boots on the ground type of work. But I think when done well, it can really pay off, and it can help you to get the information that you need to make the library more effective as well as impactful. So the next standard that we're going to look at is, this one deals with the development of collections, programs, and services. And very simply, it says that librarians and library staff shall develop collections and provide programs and services that are inclusive of the needs of all persons in the community the library serves. So again, if you if you go back to where we started off with the individual. We talked a little bit about self-reflection, thinking about, who you are, how you identify, what your values are, learning a little bit more, about the communities and learning a little bit about the cultures of the constituencies that you serve or the people that you work with. Once you've done that, then you can develop those responsive collections, and you can provide programs and services that are inclusive of the needs of all persons in the community. But it does require some foundational work. And so again, starting with the individual, doing the reflection, doing some research about the community, and then developing the collections and programs and services. I want to pause right now and share a story from a program that I attended last summer back at ALA, and there may be some people on the call who are there too. It was called Applying Racial Equity Analysis to Library Policies. So I was really interested in attending this program because at my library, we have a diversity leadership team, and we realized that one of the ways that we could be most effective was by looking at our library policies and library programs. And if you get into the literature, what you will find is that if you think there's not a lot of information about cultural competence as a whole, there's even less about how to do an analysis of your policies and programs. And so I was really excited about this program, and it ended up being a really good experience for me. So it was highly interactive, and attendees were required to gather in groups to work through a case study. And in the case, a public library was located in an area where the unemployment rate for African Americans was much higher than it was for whites. And so the library was very interested in providing some programming to address the issue. The library staff put their heads together. They decided to provide some workshops for the community. They planned, they advertised, and if I remember the case correctly, the response that they got was very minimal. They were very disappointed because they had put a lot of work into the programming, and they just didn't get the response that they thought that they would have gotten. And so as we worked in these groups, we're sitting around in groups of about 6 or so with a bunch of people that don't really know each other, but we're sitting there and we're brainstorming and we're putting our heads together with this fictional case study, trying to imagine why this programming didn't work. And so within our group, we recognized the fact that nowhere in the case study was mention of anyone from the community being involved in the planning of this event. And so basically, the library was very well-intentioned. They really wanted to have an impact. They wanted to address this problem in the community, but they didn't think to ask anyone from the community that they were reaching out to about this problem. And so essentially what you come up with is a very prescribed solution that's really probably not informed by the dynamics of the actual the problem. The program was based on assumptions about the needs of the community. And so collectively, our work group got together and we tried to imagine some of the reasons why no one came to the program. For example, if you look at the issue of unemployment, I think if I remember correctly, the workshops the library was offering were on resume writing, if I remember correctly, but I could have that wrong. But anyway, is the lack of employment really about an inability to write a resume, or is the lack of employment about a lack of employability? Is it about a lack of job skills that resonate with the opportunities in the community? So, the question comes up, did the community really need resume writing workshops, or was job training the real issue? And perhaps rather than trying to deliver this content on their own, the library could partner with the Department of Labor maybe, or other groups who are invested in workforce development. It could be that the timing of the event wasn't ideal. For example, I recently learned in trying to develop some community programming at my library that Wednesday nights, if you're trying to reach the African American community where I work, Wednesday nights is a no-no. And the reason is because many people in the community, African Americans, attend Bible study on Wednesday night. And so I don't live in this community. I happen to be African American, but I don't live here. I really was not, fluent as it relates to the community dynamics and, what happens after 5 and what's important to the community. And so as I was talking with some people from the community, they were like, no, don't have your event on Wednesday night because no one is going to come. Church is everything here, and people really look forward. We live in a rural area. They want to go out and they want to, see their friends and their family, and it's a very social type of thing. So Wednesday night is not a good night. So that example just kind of sort of shows you what can happen when you miss those opportunities to bring the community in and to build those relationships, build those partnerships, so that what you have to offer is responsive to the actual needs of the community and it addresses some of the issues. And so the last standard that I want to talk about is service delivery. And it says librarians and library staff shall be knowledgeable about and skillful in the use and provision of information services available in the community and broader society, and shall be able to make appropriate referrals for their diverse constituencies. So again, another reference to overall conceptual model. Cultural competence is a continuum. It results in changes in policies, in standards, and practices to increase opportunities for culturally diverse groups. And Standard 5 of the ACRL diversity standards really speaks to this because it focuses on service delivery. And so here we're really getting to the institutional commitment, not the personal commitment, but the institutional commitment to the success of culturally diverse groups. Libraries and information organizations can support the success of culturally diverse groups in their communities by developing their employees. And so again, if we think about our model, we start off with employees and we build into an impactful organization. And so I mentioned in my introduction that my PhD work focused on educational leadership. And for my dissertation, I used a theory called systems thinking, one aspect of which is the concept of a learning organization. A learning organization has been described as one that is able to not only develop or obtain information, but also one that is proficient in applying information and changing its behavior based on what it has learned. And I think that concept has a lot of relevance here. In a learning organization, learning is not limited to the individual. It extends to the group and to the organization. And systems thinking suggests that organizations learn and ultimately grow and change by developing their employees. And so in order to get to the cultural proficiency level that Overall talks about in her model, libraries must invest in developing their employees so that they can deliver the services that are needed by the community, regardless of its cultural makeup. And so if I could add a little bit on to this, I would say that oftentimes what I've observed as it relates to cultural competence or diversity work in libraries is that we convince ourselves that by sending individuals to training or by participating in classes, that we can kind of sort of check the cultural competence box and we can move on down the street. And I think we really deceive ourselves. If we're really, by thinking like that, if we are really committed to cultural competence, if we're committed to having relevant, impactful organizations that provide programming and services that meet the needs of the community, that elevate the community, then at some level we're going to have to start looking at changing the organization. And I'm a firm believer that where you can be most impactful is in your policies and your procedures and your practices and your service delivery. That is where you can be most effective, because again, if you go back to where we started, talking a little bit about individuals, we bring our identity, we bring our values, we bring our life experiences into our work. And in that same way, we also bring those things into our policies and procedures in our service delivery. And so it's very easy to convince ourselves that, libraries are neutral organizations and we treat everybody fairly, and this policy, is fair to everybody. But really, all of those policies are informed by the people, by the values and beliefs of the people that put them together. And so if we start doing some work around individuals, start developing cultural competency, start doing some self-reflection, start doing some professional development and some education and some travel, and, building relationships with communities that don't necessarily look like us, but that are our communities where we want to have an impact, then I believe we can move towards the cultural proficiency that Overall talks about in her article. But it cannot end and begin and end with the individual. It ultimately has to be something that is embraced by the organization as a whole to be impactful. It is, to me, very irresponsible to put the responsibility on individuals to make these types of changes. What I've seen a lot is that, rank and file library employees will participate in these trainings. They will, be really gung-ho about cultural competence and being responsive, but they're not the individuals that are empowered to make changes. And so it is important that individuals who can influence policies, who can, be involved in searches and to talk about, how we evaluate candidates and how we write job descriptions and what it really requires to do the work of libraries. That is where we can be most impactful. So I'm going to wrap up really quickly and try to leave some time at the end for some questions. I have a couple of points that I want to hone in on a little bit more just to wrap up and sort of summarize. And the first is that cultural competence is critical to the success of the library. In looking at the changing demographics, we looked at some census data, and we looked at some information from diversity counts from ALA. It's very easy to see that if we want to be successful and we want to deliver relevant collection services and resources, then we're going to have to be culturally competent, because increasingly the library workforce is not going to mirror the demographics of the communities that we serve. I think the work that ALA and some of the other organizations that have been, trying to diversify the profession, I think that's wonderful work. But if you look at the changes, there's no way that we can really keep up. And so in order to be effective, cultural competence is going to be very, very important. The second point I want to make, and I talked about this just briefly before I went into the wrap-up, is that cultural competence is both an individual and an organizational commitment. We've seen today that cultural competence runs along a continuum that begins with the individual and hopefully results in that ideal, which is the cultural proficiency. And that's, again, where we should see changes in policies and standards and practices, which should ultimately result in increased opportunities for culturally diverse groups. And then, again, the last point that I want to make is that cultural competence is a continual process. It involves learning and making adjustments based on what you learn, and then going back and relearning, and then making some additional adjustments. A lot of times people think that they can just take a class or they can just read one article and all of a sudden they're culturally competent and they never need any more training. They never need to have conversations about these issues again. And that's just not how it works. Being culturally competent is really about a continual process of reflection. And so going back to thinking, because people change, communities change. And so it's not a one-time type of deal. And so, again, culturally becoming and maintaining cultural competency requires continually reflecting, seeking knowledge, making adjustments, reflecting again, seeking knowledge again, and then making additional adjustments. But overall, I think regardless of how often you have to go through that process, as long as you remain relevant and responsive, it's worth every bit of the work. So that is all that I have. I have listed my email address here. It's shaundra.walker@gcsu.edu. I've also listed my Twitter handle. It's just my name, @Shaundra Walker, no period. If you have additional questions, if we're not able to get to your question in the Q&A, you can feel free to reach out to me using either of those methods, and I'll be happy to answer your question. And so I'm going to stop sharing now, and hopefully we can move into some questions. And let's see.
We do have a couple in chat.
Okay.
There was one of, will you please share the citation for one of the articles you assigned to precede this exercise? That was early on, so I'm thinking it was when you were talking about the course and how your first exercise that you do with the students in the course.
Sure. That article goes back to 2001. Let me pull the citation for you really quick. But it is older, but it's excellent, and it's been probably the most useful thing that I have read as it relates to cultural competence, because it is written for a library information science environment. So let me pull that citation for you, and I will paste it hopefully correctly in the chat box. And that is it. It comes from the Library Quarterly, and I just sent it. So that's the citation. I found it on Google Scholar, so hopefully you'll be able to access it there and really delve into it. Let's see.
Oh, and I think Michelle was following up. She was the one who originally asked the question, and she said it was the I am me exercise that she was talking about. Was there journal articles before that, or was it the overall one? The
overall is the main one. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle.
Let's see. It's part of the identity exercise, having others state how they perceive your beliefs or values, etc. No, it's not. And again, when I have done the exercise, the only requirement that I have for students is that they complete the exercise. It's a very no judgment type of thing, and where I have read about it, even if you were to do it in a face-to-face environment, you never make anyone feel uncomfortable. So if you don't feel comfortable, participating in it either virtually or online or face-to-face, you don't have to. The whole idea is just to have individuals to do some reflection and to really think about how they see themselves. I will say that I have participated not as the activity leader, but as a participant. Once we had a diversity trainer come to our library, and pretty much everyone felt comfortable sharing, and if people didn't feel comfortable sharing, no one was really put on the hot seat, and so it really worked out fine. But I think even getting people to think about how they identify themselves, even if you don't share it with anyone else, if you just think about it, it can really be eye-opening and it can be informative. So if people take nothing else away from it than that, then I think it can be helpful. Let's see. Any additional questions, Annette? I don't know if I missed anything.
There was one from Melody that mentioned, what journals do you suggest? And Melody, if that was any specific thing or just for cultural competence in general, or if there was a specific question, go ahead and you can let us know in chat. But there was one question about that, is what journals do you suggest?
I have to say that my degree is not in library and information science, and so my PhD is not in library and information science. And so what I have found helpful, a lot of it has been outside of our discipline. With that being said, I found information from, education to be helpful, particularly education leadership, because that's, what I do, social work, some sociology. But in terms of journals, I would say in the library with the lead pipe is a great resource. I found some really helpful stuff there. There's also a new journal called the Journal of Critical Library Information Studies. I think they're just really getting off the ground. I think last year was their first year, back in 2017, but I see a lot of promise in them. I think some of the good stuff that I've read, it would be great, I think, if there was a one-stop shopping place to go for this, but a lot of the stuff is dispersed in different journals. I've read some good things in college and research libraries, Library Quarterly. I've actually set up like a Google Scholar Alert, I believe, where I can get some information about recently published literature on the topic. But again, there's not a whole lot out there. I would, if you're interested, it's not directly related, but I don't know how many people are familiar with the hashtag CritLib, CRITLIB. That sort of movement often talks about these types of topics, particularly the practical aspect of it. So what does it look like for different areas of the library? What does this look like if you're doing information literacy? What does this look like if you work in technical services? What does this look like if you work in archives? If you're someone who is on Twitter, you may want to search out that hashtag, and you can become familiar with, some of the voices that are having these types of conversations. But it's a really, I think for our profession, it's an emerging topic, and one that I hope will develop a lot more in the future.
And we have a few more questions popping in. One is your presentation available for download? And if you would like us to, we can do that, but I will leave that up to you, Shaundra. We will at least have the recording made available. So if nothing else, you could at least go back and look at it. But the PowerPoint itself, I leave that up to the speakers.
Okay. And I will see what I can do for the presentation. I tried to just use the slides like for talking points more, so I'm not sure how useful it could be, but I could probably go back and massage it a little bit so that if you wanted to view the slides independent of the recording, you could still get something out of it. So I'll try to do that, and I'll share it with Annette.
That would be wonderful, and I can send out the file to any of you who are attending today, as well as those who had registered, because I know there were some that couldn't make it. And along those same lines, but also to answer the other question, is Shaundra's course for Library Juice Academy. I just posted the link. That is at least her most recent, or the one that's coming up here very shortly. And I will remind MCR librarians, academic and hospital medical health science librarians, if you have a health science connection and you're an academic or health science library, don't forget we have professional development funds too that can be used for things like Library Juice Academy courses. It doesn't have to be just for conferences and stuff. So if you're interested and you're in our mid-continental region, reach out to us and for a professional development award, because her session's going to start here March 5th. So I'm so excited that you presented today when you're very, approaching a very imminent deadline here.
Yeah. So I hope that you all enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions whatsoever, you can feel free to just shoot me an email. Again, it's my name, shaundra.walker@gcsu.edu, or you can find me on Twitter, and I will be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Again, this was just like a a really quick introduction to cultural competence. I certainly could not do it justice within an hour, but I hope that it gave you some things to think about, and I hope that you are poised to begin the process of developing cultural competence within yourself, as well as building those culturally competent libraries.
And I am seeing a quick question about CE certificate. For our briefing webinars, we don't automatically have MLA CEs, but I do know you can use, you can put them on the forms from MLA, and oftentimes they will take it. But if you need help with that, let me know. You can email me, and I've emailed the registrants, and my email's also on the MCR website if you have more questions about CE. So there isn't one automatically with this, but we can often kind of help you get the right information so you can put it on a form, especially if you're doing things like consumer health information specialists, which is classes, that kind of stuff. Shaundra, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation, and I'm going to have to go look through it all again to look at the charts and the flow and all of that. It was wonderful to see a model, and sometimes I know it's intimidating on a place of where to start, and I think you gave so many great recommendations.
Well, thank you so much, and as I said when we started, I'm really honored and humbled that you would ask me to share this information, and I hope that people got something out of it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, I am going to stop the...
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel. Select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.